My name's Esther Bentley. I'm married to Simon, who's the chairman of Yad Vashem UK, and I'm a Holocaust educator as well. I've been a Holocaust educator for about 20 years now. I've worked at the Imperial War Museum, the Jewish Museum, and I've also been an educational advisor to Yad Vashem UK. So I come to you as more of a Holocaust educator than a psychologist, because if you've read the book, you will know that Edith Eger is a very famous clinical psychologist. She is a Holocaust survivor as well, so that's why it is relevant to Yad Vashem. And it's a book that you know, can be taken from the viewpoint of the Holocaust, but also from the viewpoint of seeing it as a very valuable self-help group, especially in these very challenging times at the moment. Now, the book is The Gift, which I hope some of you have read, 12 Lessons to Save Your Life, it says. And it follows on from her best-selling book, The Choice, which some of you might have read. And in this book, Dr. Edith Eger, a Holocaust survivor and clinical psychologist, believes that people have the choice after suffering a trauma or a loss to give in to suffering and become a victim, or to live every moment of life as a gift. She draws on her experiences as a Holocaust survivor and her therapy work with victims of PTSD, physical and mental trauma, war veterans, military personnel, victims of abuse, anyone that suffered bereavement or divorce. And she uses her experiences in Auschwitz and afterwards as well to help others to survive and respond. Now, the book, The Gift, is endorsed on the front cover by that famous, very unbiased interviewer of royals, Oprah, who says, "I will be forever changed by Dr. Eger's story." So I'm not really sure if that is an endorsement or not, depending on your view of Oprah and that interview. But definitely, it definitely appeals to an American audience that, and perhaps people that have been through therapy. I mean, I was very inspired by the book as well, but, you know, people might have mixed feelings about it. I'm going to give you a bit of a background into Edith Eger for those of you that don't know about her experience during the war. She was born in Hungary, and in 1944, at the age of 16, she was a budding gymnast at the time. She was actually picked for the Olympic team, and she was a very, very good ballerina. Had a steady boyfriend called Eric, who she was very much in love with. And then everything changed for the family. On 19th of March, 1944, Germany occupied Hungary. And between the 15th of May and 9th of July, 1944, over 434,000 Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and about 80% were gassed on arrival. Edith and her parents and her older sister Magda were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau the day after the Seder night in 1944. So it's reminiscent of this time. When they arrived, her father tried to assure them that they were there just to work and everything would be okay. But when they got to the selection camp at Birkenau, Dr. Eger said that Joseph Mengele was there, and he asked her if her mother was her sister. I think her mother looked quite young, and Edith answered with an answer that she regrets to this day, and that was, she said, "Yes, it is my mother." And as a result of that, her mother and her father were taken away, and they were murdered soon after arrival. She was forced that evening, when her mother and father were taken away, to actually dance for Dr. Mengele. She was chosen by Dr. Mengele to dance for him because he knew that she was a ballerina. And that probably saved her life and that of her sister. But she couldn't forgive herself for what had happened to her mother. She felt very responsible for her mother's death in particular because of what she'd answered him. If you go in the introduction to the gift on page 2, she says, and if you've got a copy, you can look at it, it's near the bottom. Each moment in Auschwitz was hell on earth. It was also my best classroom. Subjected to loss, torture, starvation, and the constant threat of death, I discovered the tools for survival and freedom that I continue to use every day in my clinical psychology practice, as well as in my own life. She also believes, as a therapist, that there's no hierarchy of suffering. You know, she has patients that come to her and say, how can I compare what's happened to me with what's happened to you? You know, you were in Auschwitz, you suffered the most horrific conditions there, you lost your parents immediately, your boyfriend, Eric, actually also died when he was taken to Auschwitz. But she believes there's no hierarchy of suffering. She believes everyone's suffering is unique. And she says that on page 3, that although our lives have probably been very different, many of us experience feeling trapped in our minds. Our thoughts and beliefs determined and often limit how we feel, what we do, and what we think is possible. In my work, I've discovered that while our imprisoning beliefs show up and play out in unique ways, there are some common mental prisons that contribute to suffering. This book is a practical guide to help us identify our mental prisons and develop the tools we need to become free. Now, in this book, in The Choice, the first book I was referring to, it's in 3 parts. She tells about her experiences during Auschwitz and the death march she's forced to go on and the horrific slave labor conditions she had to endure. And finally, her painful liberation in May 1945. Soon after the war, she married a fellow Hungarian who had been a partisan during the war, and they eventually ended up in America. But she was, you know, they built a life for themselves. She worked in a factory. She had 3 children. But the third part of the book covers her long journey to true liberation, which she calls her true liberation, many years later, when she fully confronted her past after many, many years of denying her grief and trauma. And one of her main influences was Viktor Frankl, who is a big proponent of choice therapy. And that's why she called the book The Choice, I suppose. And she studied under him for her doctorate in clinical psychology, which she only gained in 1978. So that's over 30 years after the war. He was a fellow survivor of Auschwitz who taught her not to be a shrink, but a stretch. He emphasized that you must feel the feelings and not deny or internalize your feelings. And whatever comes out of your body is going to heal your body. However, whatever stays in and you internalize will harm your body. Each chapter in the gift, which follows on from The Choice, describes a mental prison that prevents people from moving on and healing after any kind of loss or trauma that they may suffer. For example, the chapters are each named, and you've got chapters like the prison of avoidance, self-neglect, victimhood, paralyzing fear, guilt and shame, not forgiving, judgment, and so on. And she uses actual case studies from her therapy work with all the names changed, plus her own experiences during the war, and especially when she was in Auschwitz, to enlighten the reader and reach conclusions. And a big point that she concludes and she emphasizes during the book is that you cannot heal without feeling. You cannot forgive people without going through anger and grieving. There's always bound to be anger at some point and rage. And she encourages people to be in touch with this anger, but not get overwhelmed by it. But in order to heal, you have to go through these feelings to free yourself from the negative feelings that are holding you back. Now, I'm just giving you this as a background to the book, because what I really want to discuss today is the book was written before the pandemic. And she has given a TED talk during the pandemic, actually, when she made it, she was asked about the book and the relevance of the book to the pandemic. As we all know, the pandemic is still going on, and we don't know how long it's going to last. We sort of now could see the light at the end of the tunnel because of the vaccine, but there still may be blips along the way. We've all, so many people have suffered so terribly from these unprecedented times with their health, with bereavement, anxiety, financial losses, mental health problems, problems of isolation and loneliness. And so can we live every moment as a gift in current times? That's the big question. How would Dr. Eger, if she was writing this book today, make this book more relevant and current? In a recent TED talk, she does say that we can definitely use it as a guide. It's very important during these times to unite and not just focus on me, and the individual, but look outwards and try and find a purpose in life through reaching out to others, which many have done with lots of charity work and delivering meals and looking after people and phoning people if they're isolated. Also, she talks about trying to minimize your exposure to the news and make sure you're not constantly watching news reports every day. And, you know, focusing on exercising and fresh air, etc. So what she feels is that suffering makes people learn new priorities. And if you go through this kind of suffering, you actually can evolve better. Even though we're all going through all this loss and uncertainty, we can evolve as a survivor of it and as a better person. I would say that, you know, even, you know, there is a comparison, but it's a difficult one to make. You can never compare the Holocaust with anything really, because it was an unprecedented, horrific genocide. But there are comparisons with this pandemic being such an unprecedented situation as well. And none of us have ever had to face not being able to have family time together during festivals, you know, hugging our relatives, seeing people, not being able to travel abroad, not being able to celebrate social events, life cycle events like bar mitzvahs and weddings and bat mitzvahs. And it's definitely affected all of us in many different ways, mental health wise, physically. Some people have got ill through it. So unfortunately, some people have passed away. Long COVID is another issue. So you know, is this book, The Gift, a book that we could use to try and help us cope with what we've all been coping with the past year? So I'll throw that out now, and then we can have a bit of a discussion about that. And and then later on, if there's anyone that wants to ask a particular question about the book, or I can bring up another question about the book that interested me. But I'd like to unmute everyone now and throw up the discussion about the gift in the light of the pandemic, really. Okay, Sophie, you're going to unmute. You've done it. So you're all very mute. Has anyone got any idea about what they think about this book, or whether they like the book, whether what lessons resonated the most with people in the book, or did they feel it was very American self-help therapy kind of thing?
Well, I'll go first because I haven't actually read The Gift, but I have read The Choice, and I found it absolutely fascinating. Not just the historical, her own story, but the life lessons that she gives through her therapy. And actually, It's one of the books that I said to myself, well, you know what, I'd like to read it like in a year or so time. I mean, I read it probably about a year and a half ago or something, you know, to go back and revisit and just to pick up other tidbits that, you know, I didn't learn the first time that I read it. So, and I'm always inspired by hearing her.
Yes. And you haven't read The Gift, because it's actually quite a short book. It won't be long. Yeah,
that's what I read on the reviews.
Yes. Has anyone read The Gift that's on? Yes. Esther.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about it? You're American.
It's interesting, because when I started it, I thought, oh, I don't need this. I'm in a good place. I don't need any psychology now. Everything's great. And as I got into it, I found myself really like crying and dealing with a lot of issues as a second generation. And, you know, how do we pass on that legacy without it completely squashing our lives? How do we have a perspective on it and pass on the legacy without feeling overwhelmed by it? And how responsible are we to those family members who were killed, and to, on the other side, to our own lives to live and enjoy and make the most that we can of our lives? So I found it very interesting and difficult in places.
Yeah, I agree. What were your parents survivors? When you say your second generation?
My mother, and you said once that your father's family came from Rovno?
Yeah, they did, yeah.
So my mother came from just up the road from Sarny.
Okay.
Which was, and my father came from a little village, Chartorisk, that's near there. My father left in 1921 and my mother left in 41, just before the Germans arrived. So she's not strictly a survivor, but the Michigas was the same. And she lost her entire family. I'm named after her mother. And I've always been interested in the Shoah to try and get to know my family and what life was like. And all along, whenever I feel like I've gone through a difficult period, I thought, how can I complain at what my grandmother suffered nearly a year in a ghetto, and having lost her family, it's you know, how do we compare?
Yeah.
And how do we deal with that? So I think these are lifelong issues that we have, and to try and come to terms with that. And I had a friend once who was a second generation also, and I said to him, I'm really worried I'm going to screw up my kids with this. And he says, oh no, it'll take 5 or 6 generations before it works through. Such a relief.
I mean, do you think that there is a hierarchy of grief? Do you think that if you've been through Auschwitz, if you've been through Auschwitz or you're a survivor, and you go to a survivor, oh, I'm feeling really bad today because this happened or that happened, do you think that we have a right to kind of like, you know, feel that we, you know, that we can also grieve, and we can also talk about our losses and what's going on in our lives, you know, if you are talking to somebody who's been through Auschwitz?
I don't think that pain can be compared. Pain is pain. And I did therapy myself years ago and sort of realized that, or came to the conclusion that my issues and my losses were as important to me as my mother's losses were to her. But it's difficult. But Edith writes a beautiful story about how a talk that she gave in Europe, and a survivor asked her a question and says, you know, when you got to Auschwitz, why didn't you resist? And she answers beautifully by saying she starts thinking of all the reasons why, you know, this was impossible. And then she realized that it's not about her. And she just says to him, thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing your story, or whatever. And it's so powerful. because it's really, no matter what kind of trauma people have been through, and I keep thinking about the kids growing up in Syria, how, if you've seen your parents killed or you've lived in a war zone, you can't compare. There's no scale for comparing pain, but the healing processes are the same, whether they happen sooner or later, hopefully. But what we carry with us is the same.
Yeah. Is anyone else who read the book want to
Yeah.
say anything? Yeah.
Well, I haven't quite finished the book because I was having a lot of difficulty because I trained as a group therapist. I also trained with a Holocaust survivor, Eugene Heimler, and his work has great influence on me. And I see her throughout the book going against every rule of therapy. She talks about her family. She talks about herself. She gives advice. She calls patients honey. It's so against it, and yet she's come out with really good, sane stuff. And I also watched her an interview with Ranji Chatterjee. It's really worth watching, and the effect she's had on him. And also, I mean, it's hard to believe that if Oprah really thinks she'll be forever changed, why didn't she recommend this to Megan?
Right.
A good point.
You should. Yeah. Is there anyone else that I mean, does it resonate for anyone because of what we've been going through the last year? I mean, did you find it of help because of that, or did you just see it as a book written by her as a therapist and a Holocaust survivor?
I was just going to add, not on that point, actually on your previous point, Esther, about whether you can compare suffering.
Yeah.
So Maya's also on this. We actually listened to a podcast with Edith being interviewed by a young American guy, a podcaster whose name I don't know. And I actually did, even though I do agree that you can't compare suffering, I did find it a bit frustrating that he was using her experience to talk about his own experiences, which weren't necessarily particularly, I mean, he didn't really speak about what his experiences were, but it felt like even though he was using her as a therapist to go through what he'd been through, I don't know, I don't have much more to say other than I did find it a bit frustrating because I felt that it's highly unlikely that anything that maybe I'm wrong, but you didn't get the feeling that he'd been through a specific traumatic event, but rather that he was I don't know how to, I'm not sure if I'm articulating myself very well, but rather that he was just talking about his own serious experiences. And I did just find that a little bit frustrating because you're hearing from this great woman who's been through such tragedies and come out positive and come out with this unbelievable attitude to life. And I'm not sure someone that's been through minor life challenges that we all go through, that I don't think are anything, that I don't think they can compare to what she went through. I think at times when you listen to that can be quite frustrating.
Yeah, I think she does even remember the time scale. She came out of the war 1945, and she went through a lot of denial and avoidance of what she'd been through. She didn't want to tell her kids she'd been through the Holocaust. It was her husband that told her kids. She had a difficult relationship with her husband, and a lot of the anger and resentment she had from the war was projected onto her husband. I think she had a son with learning difficulties, and that caused a lot of problems for her. So it was only in 1978 when she became a clinical psychologist, I think even a year or two after she'd become a clinical psychologist, that she suddenly realized that she couldn't deny what she'd been through anymore. And, you talk about the American the way she called people honey and but I'm not sure if that's just the way she's written her book or whether it actually did happen. But certainly in her talks, she talks like that. She's got her personality comes through very strongly in her talks, and people obviously love her as a therapist and love her as a person. She's got a hell of a lot of followers in America particularly, but here as well. One of the things she talks about with is there's no forgiveness without rage. What do you think of that? There's no forgiveness without rage, that we can't heal from a loss or grievance with someone else without anger. Do you agree with that? Does anyone have an opinion on that?
I don't think it's mandatory.
You don't think it's mandatory, yeah. I
think it, depending upon our experience and our personality, we can or we cannot. I don't think it's mandated. What you've just quoted implies that she's saying it's essential. I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
I didn't see it like that. I saw it more as she's saying it's a sort of natural course that you have to go through. You have to feel anger first before you can get to the next stage.
Yeah.
I think she's saying this is what you must do. I think she's saying this is the process.
Yeah, it's not like, you know, you've immediately got to feel anger if you've had a loss. I think she's talking about a journey that people have got to go through. And it's in chapter 12, actually, she talks about this. It's quite an interesting chapter to read, actually, if you get the book, because she does talk about there's no forgiveness without rage, that people are often in their mind have a mental prison of not forgiving, and that's why they can't move on. I just thought it was an interesting chapter, that one. I don't know if anyone else did, but she does talk about it as a journey, the journey of loss, feeling and healing, kind of loss, feeling, and the feeling is the anger. I think what she's talking about is that if we feel, you know, if we want to really truly heal, we need to kind of externalize our anger and our feelings, and not to overwhelm us, but to kind of spend, say, 30 minutes of the day in your room screaming to the pillow, or actually venting against the world about what's happened to you. And then move on, like get on with your life, you know, don't let it consume your every day, your every hour or every day, but it's a healthy thing to do. That's what she feels, I think. It's an interesting one, that one. Do you want to add anything at the moment? I'm going to get him involved now.
No, the trouble is, this is a difficult subject, because unless you've studied it properly, then you don't have expertise, and the views you have are going to be too off the cuff. I'm intrigued that Viktor Frankl, who I don't know anywhere near enough about, but was a survivor and was a very, very famous psychologist. Yes. Subsequently, correct? He invented the search for meaning, whatever. It's interesting that she trained under him, and whether there was something they had in common that made it easier for her to train with him and under his guidance and so on. But were there many examples of other psychologists who were involved as survivors or not?
I don't really know that one, but I know that she talks about the 4 main influences in her life, and in her therapy, and she names him as one of the main ones. And certainly the therapy methods she uses, the choice therapy methods she uses, come from him. Yeah, because what she focuses on is the goal, the search for meaning, like the goal. So and that's the thing that anchors everybody. So for example, now with the vaccine, with all the uncertainty that's been going on, at least if we know that perhaps we're going to come out of this because there's a vaccine, and we're going to find a way out, because the vaccine has proved to be a very big success, and it is sort of very cliched wise, the light at the end of the tunnel. it's very important when you go on a journey like the ones that her patients go through, that they have to have a goal in the end, you know, that anchors them and gets them through it. Yeah.
I know that, I think it was Viktor Frankl spoke about the one thing the Nazis couldn't do was take over the people's minds. The one thing they had was their own mind, which could not be interfered physically, of course, in every possible way. And it was that made the difference to those that did survive, if they had the ability or choice to potentially get through, was their being able to exercise their independence of mind.
Yeah. I also love Viktor Frankl, but didn't he also have there was quite a bit of backlash to some of his books from some Holocaust survivors who said that, you know, that was quite a simplistic way in some ways of looking at the luck of whether you were shot or not on any given day. So I do also think that's interesting in Viktor Frankl's, but it makes sense why he was such a big influence on Edith, who I think is interestingly, hers is, because her writings are much more not focused on the Holocaust, but on, like Esther said, like on her life post the Holocaust and how she recovered from that.
Yeah.
She says something similar to that, though. She does say that before her mum actually left her to, like, in Auschwitz, that her mum said exactly what you just said about Dr. Frankl, which was like, no one can take away what you put in your mind. And that's like the self-help like quote she says all the time. It's like, whichever situation you're in, like, all you need to do is have hope and push yourself through. That's why her book is quite relatable to now, because although her situation was a lot tougher than ours now, she gives you kind of a framework to work around to make you go out of this framework, like mind frame of being like in a hole stuck. She gives you hope whatever your situation is, and that's what I think her book focuses on, rather than her experiences. Like, you can get out of your situation, you just need to follow the right steps, like being angry and feeling the feels and being able to actually feel what you actually feel and tell people, and then you'll get out of it. So I think that's her main like quote and what she preaches most.
I think it's interesting, the statement that you can't say one thing is worse than another, which frankly, off the cuff, I think, as you were saying, Hannah, to a degree is preposterous. Please don't tell me that somebody who's been through Auschwitz, Birkenau, and all the successions and survived that is not worse than what other comparable, more mundane events and so on. It feels to me, though, she can say that, and maybe it serves what she's trying to influence by saying that, but it's only someone like her that can say that, because it's the greatest chutzpah in the world for somebody else to say that too, for example.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think maybe that's why I got a bit frustrated in the podcast I listened to, because it wasn't her saying that, it was the the young 20-year-old podcast interviewer saying that, whereas she probably could feel it, but I think you're 100% right, you feel like only she had the authority to say it.
But when you read the book, and she gives examples from people that she's treated, she actually really truly believes herself that there isn't a hierarchy of suffering. She said, she quotes a patient that came to her, and she's distraught because her husband has ordered her a red Cadillac instead of a blue one, and she can't cope with that, and it's the wrong design, and it's the wrong, and prior to that, she'd seen people who were on the verge of suicide or had been raped, I can't remember, but she said, like, for this woman, what was behind all this was the husband was having an affair. He was buying her presents to appease her. They were on the brink of divorce. This was a terrible trauma in her life. And this was as important to her as anyone else going through a tremendous trauma as well. So somebody wants to talk. Yeah. Do you want to talk? Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't read the book, but I can empathise with this anger thing. I mean, just briefly, I went for an operation late March last year, contracted COVID, and my husband, who'd had Alzheimer's for 12 years, diagnosed at the age of 49, He, bless him, he died in the home that he was in. Now, I never saw him, because I was very ill, and secondly, even if I hadn't been ill, I wouldn't have been allowed to go and see him. So I was angry. That was my first emotion, was anger, because my children had run the home every day and been told that, yeah, he was fine. And yet when I rang on the day I came out of hospital, I was told he was on end of life. They must have known that. So I directed my anger at the home, at the hospital where I caught COVID, which incidentally was Darlington Memorial, Stephen. And I'd lost my husband of 48 years and not even said goodbye. So I can understand this anger. You grieve late, I grieved later, but I was fueled by anger. I arranged, well, my son arranged the funeral, but we went through the motions of the funeral, and it was all with anger. We were angry that he was put down as having COVID when he didn't, but the results didn't come back soon enough. Because they thought he had COVID, they couldn't get the death certificate because the doctor wouldn't go and examine him and identify him as his patient. So yeah, I get what she's saying, even though I haven't read the book. This anger that it precedes grief, or it certainly did for me. I was so caught up in my anger that I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't feel sorry for myself. I was sorry for other people. I was sorry I'd lost my husband, but it wasn't about me. It was about everybody else that had done the wrong things and caused the situation. So I can understand that.
Mm-hmm. I'm really sorry for your loss. I think you should read the book. It might help you, actually. It's a worthwhile read, especially if you've gone through something like that. It definitely is. I'm going to read out something from the conclusion now, which
conclusion is very good.
Oh, okay. a brief. I mean, you know, we can carry on talking, but I'm just to highlight, because it kind of carries on from that, is that in the conclusion she says, she does conclude everything, but she also says we can't take away suffering, we can't change what happened, but we can choose to find the gift in our lives. We can even learn to cherish the wound. I'm sure the wound is very raw and open for you at the moment, but we you know, perhaps with time, it will become less of a wound, and you'll be able to see some more positive things and, you know, some more hopeful things in the future. How did people feel about that conclusion? Do you think she's right to say that? That you can cherish the wound if you've been through terrible things, or if you've suffered a bereavement, or if you know, suffered terrible financial losses from the pandemic. What do you think? Think you can cherish the wound?
I don't think I could.
Maybe in retrospect, when you've got past the grieving stage, where you can look at it differently, not necessarily when you're in it. I think you have to go through a different, you know, go through a stage before you get there.
Yeah. I think she is talking about going through all the stages as well, because when you read this, you know, this is very superficial. What I'm saying, you have to read the book, but there are stages of grief, obviously, as we know, and it can take 2 to 3 years to really adjust to particularly a bereavement, a bad bereavement, you know, and a loss. And you go through all these different stages till you can adjust to it. But I think
if I could chip in there, sorry.
The one thing I would say is maybe we need to be wary of being prescriptive about how people should feel. And cherish is a challenging word. It's probably there for effect more than anything else. But you know, you've got your 7 stages of denial, and you know, you should get better after X once you've been through all the 7 stages and the 7, you know. And I think we just need to say, well, how do you feel? You know, instead of saying, well, you must be so sad because of that. Well, that's you assuming you are and projecting your feelings onto it. It's likely people will feel extremely angry about certain things, and that's a perfectly natural response. But other people might not be. You know, the classic example in some of the training I've done is one person might feel awful about a debt of £100, and one person might have no worry at all about carrying £2,000 of debt on their credit card from month to month. Different people feel different ways about the same thing, in a sense, or even inversely like that. So I think it's important to make people aware of these things, but perhaps just to be wary of being prescriptive about how you should feel and let people talk about how they do feel. I think that's very important.
I was just going to say that I'm a bereavement supporter. I've worked for 8 years supporting bereaved people, and I don't think there are any rules. And I think every person has a different experience in relation to their loss due to the type of relationship that they've had, based on the circumstances in which they've lost a person. And there's one thing that comes to mind when I think about grief and how one comes to terms with it, or how one might not come to terms with it, but it's something around the idea of being able to grow around your loss and how you're able to integrate the loss into your life as you try to move forward.
I think that's a good example. I listened to a couple in their 30s speak about having lost a child who was born with a heart problem, seemed to be getting better, and effectively just died in the playground. And what the image they used was this circle was their life.
Yeah.
And suddenly that circle was filled by blackness.
Yes.
And they're never going to forget that child. They're never going to stop loving it. They're probably never going to stop, these are more their words, feeling pain about it. And that size of that black circle may never go away. But just as you've said, Naomi, that other circle will start to grow around it potentially. And it might expand, but that thing is always going to potentially, for them anyway, be there. And I suspect for many people who have had traumatic experiences, you know, if you live in denial that this thing didn't happen to me, then that isn't probably going to help you. It's probably not going to be functional. So recognizing it for what it is and how you feel about it might let you grow around it, if that's kind of paraphrasing what you mean.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think that this idea of time, and it can be unhelpful, and I think people find their way towards certainly in my experience, I've had people that have come to me 20 years after a loss and 2 months after a loss. It's very much depends on the circumstances and how a person, or how ready a person is to face their loss and face the pain, because inevitably it's almost easier to turn away from the pain than it is to confront it, which is why it takes so many people such a long time sometimes to work through their grief, I think.
If I can just share something personal with you on that front. 21 years ago, I nearly died. I had a terrible skiing accident, had brain surgery following it. I'm blind in my left eye. I can't smell, can't feel half my head. But I was faced in that situation with a year's worth of recovery, which was probably more like 2 or 3 years of real length of time in recovery. I just decided I'm only looking forward. I can't undo what I've got and what I'm saddled with. So I've only got one life, like we all have only got one life. So that's what I've done. I've just looked forward, and I'm grateful for the good years I had till I was 44. and I got on with it. And I know different people, I think, Andy, you were saying, different people have different ways of feeling about all situations, which is so true. And I'm sure it's all of our experiences we're dealing with other people. In my case, I just decided I'm not going to be saddled with it. So I have got that black circle as you've just described, but hopefully I've got a much bigger circle around that black circle, which means I'm getting on with it. And of course, I've got lots to be grateful for, my Esther that I'm sitting next to, and my beautiful 4 children and grandchildren and so on. So I get that sense of when I have something to grieve about, there's a period for grieving and a period for hopefully being able to get on and enjoy or make the most of the rest of one's life.
Yeah, I hadn't read the book, but I came to it because I was interested, and the Viktor Frankl connection is because I'd read a lot about Irvin Yalom's psychotherapy, existential psychotherapy, and I think that kind of visceral experience can take you to the point where you suddenly realize, well, what is the meaning of life? And am I totally isolated? I could have died at any stage in that experience. And it brings you to face with those existential concerns, many of which you've got no control over. So the only control you've got is what's in your head and how you react to them, and how you feel about them. And that can be liberating, but it can also be terrifying.
Yeah, I agree. And I having lived with Simon through his whole trauma and the recovery and everything, he is a very mentally strong person. Not everyone is as mentally and physically strong, but not everyone is as physically and mentally strong as him. So a lot of people would not have reacted in the same way as he did. So, you know, as you say, you can't generalize. But you know, I do think if you read the book, it's not going to make you into suddenly a very strong mentally strong person, but it definitely can inspire you to perhaps change some of the things that are going on in your mind that are stopping you from achieving certain goals, or, you know, from changing your attitude about things, not to be so judgmental about things, not to be, you know, perhaps not to be in denial about things. You know, it can have that effect if it appeals to you. It doesn't appeal to everyone, but if it appeals to you, then I think it is quite a good book for that. Has anyone got anything else before we wrap up, or Simon's going to announce what the next book is soon.
Can I just say that, just for people maybe who haven't read the book, that she, throughout the book, she does say that you don't get over the trauma, that you don't forget about it, which I think is very important. But she finds a way to live with it. So she says she's still tortured by all this, but she has found a way to move on from it. It is always with you. And I think that's important. She's not telling people, do this exercise and it's over and it's gone. She's showing people how to manage it. She's very much saying it will always be with you.
Yeah, she talks about still having nightmares about the Holocaust.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Eugene Heimler, who was also Hungarian, one of the things I remember him saying was, you can't change history, but you can change how you look at it. And we can actually see that now in the UK with the attitudes towards slavery and empire and the colonies that we always thought were great. We're now changing how we see that. And that's what Edith Eger is saying too. She's not going to forget it, but she has survived it. It doesn't mean everybody can survive it, but she is looking at it as a different experience. She's looking at it as something she's survived. And from there, she moved on to be a different person to what she might have been if she hadn't been to Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Esther, I think your question at the beginning about how that pandemic has affected us, because we're in the middle of it, or hopefully near the end. I think when we come through it and we have a chance to look back on how this year has affected us, then the book will have, and her approach will be even more meaningful.
Yeah, You're right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need a bit of space and time. Yeah. I think it will, you know, we're not going to just come out of it this year and go back to partying and weddings and well, hopefully hugging is second nature to most of us. But I think people will take time to adjust. They really will. They will feel weird when they're at a concert or a theatre or a, you know, a big wedding. I think they will feel a little bit, oh my gosh, should I be going near all these people?
Vulnerable.
Yeah.
I really think so too. And I also think that when you go through a personal trauma, you know how you personally you know how you personally learn from that and grow from that. And I hope that as we've been through communal trauma, we'll still be able to take lessons. And there's been so many ways that, I mean, I think my life has improved because of the way that life has had to adapt and change and slow down and the change of pace of life. And I do hope that when we are excited to get back to normal life, I agree that we are able to reflect back on this time and take with us lessons that allow us to grow and just to learn.
I think there's one analogy I heard which I think is interesting, and you can't draw parallels necessarily from history, but if you think the Spanish flu, as it was called at the time in 1918, 1919, 1920, which was comparable to this, even more so because it killed so many more people, but you were also talking about financial crisis, which had just happened as well and happened again in 1929. And we've just been through both really in 2008, 9, 10 and the pandemic 2019, 2020. And in a sense, a lot of people pointed to the extremism, friends of mine, people I speak to, that arose in the 1920s and 1930s, political extremism from uncertainty, from poverty, from traumatizing experience of World War I. And it kind of concerns me to an extent that, because I think, Hannah, you mentioned collective trauma. And I think there is potentially going to have been a collective trauma over the last 10 years. And the people pointed to the hedonism of the 1920s, the massive changes of social changes of the 1920s, but also political extremism. And I think if you look around the globe, there is virulent nationalism growing around, white American nationalism. I don't even need to list them. But I'm also concerned about individual traumas, because there's a lot of my colleagues who, in particular, women who've borne the brunt again of trying to do their work from home and trying to raise kids, trying to homeschool them, and just been sitting in massive traumatic situations and coming through that and coming out of that, and not even perhaps knowing that they've been through trauma and thinking, how do you then cope with that? I think that could be a massive issue for a lot of people in the next few years. I don't know where I'm going with that, forgive me. It sounds like I've run out of steam, but it's an important thing to think about, I think.
I agree with you. As one of my many hats, I chair something called Gingerbread. And Gingerbread is the largest organisation representing single parents in England and Wales. So over 2 million people it represents. Or if you think about single parents, 90% of whom are women, looking after their children in the current environment with jobs that they've either lost or have not been able to retain on 0-hour contracts, because that's the way they have to have those jobs because of their dual responsibilities. So they're broke, they've got homeschooling, most of them not in great financial circumstances in the first place, desperate, really difficult times. So yeah, so for most of us, it's been rubbish, it's been difficult in many different ways, but there are many, many others, huge numbers, for whom it's been just awful. And yes, what is the outcome? In terms of the assistance will stop to the extent it's been assistance. So yeah, it's frightening what is yet to be felt.
Yeah, I think so. And my neighbour's about 85, 86. I don't think she's been out of her house in 11 months. 11 months inside a house on her own, recently widowed. That must be a common experience, and that isolation potentially, for many people, they might feel terrible about that. Some people might not. They've maybe got a routine which is predictable and manageable, and it works. So yeah, I think this book can give hope and optimism and means of coping, but how many people can actually access that kind of message? It's difficult to predict.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're going to finish there. I think Simon's going to just announce what the next book is.
The next book club is going to be taking place on the 27th of April, and you'll be receiving invitations being sent out tomorrow. It's a book called The Crate by a woman called Deborah Levison. I have read the book. It's a really good book, and it's quite different in terms of its setting. Her parents were Holocaust survivors, and it's very centered on events in Canada, with her living in New York and so on. It's a very good perspective from a second generation to parent survivors and so particular circumstances of what took place. And she will be the person who will be present for us on the 27th of April. Presenting it is are the words I was trying to come up with. But thankfully, I assisted very well. Am I right?
Okay.
Thank you.
Will you go?
Thank you very much.
Okay.